Joining us now via video is Jeff Deist, the president of Mises, Mises Institute, Mises.org. And here to talk about the national divorce conversation that's sparking up. Good morning to you, Jeff. Thanks for your time today.
Yes, good morning, and very interesting times.
Yeah, amen to that. There was an article I saw at the Daily Wire just this morning, actually. Came out, I think, last night. Headline says, Texas lawmaker files Texit bill to prompt citizen vote on exploring secession from the United States. This is a conversation that's come up a lot more recently. Marjorie Taylor Green bringing it up again, I think it was last week. But this is not new. It's been around a long time. Texas has had an effort now for many years to secede again from the Union. Oregon counties are begging to leave Oregon. They want to leave Portland behind and join Idaho. There are counties in California that want to do this. Even New Hampshire's legislators had talked about this in the last voting cycle. So it's not new. It's happening kind of all over the place. What are we to make of this, Jeff Deist? What say you?
Well, Texas is a very interesting case in that, first of all, it's very, very large. It has an enormous economy. It has major cities. It has ports. And most importantly, perhaps, it has a history of existing as a sovereign nation. And as a matter of fact, Texans insisted on having that written into the agreement when they joined the broader union. So Texas has always, in its own mind, been a republic which could break away and exist independently at any time, or even rejoin Mexico. There's all kinds of scenarios. And so we tend to look at this through a lens of presentism. We tend to say, there's manifest destiny, there's 50 states, the United States moved westward, and this is all set in stone. But all we have to do is go back and look at, let's say, the map of modern Europe today versus 100 years ago, or 120 years ago, before the First World War, before the Great War. Even since the Second World War, there have been huge changes. The former Yugoslavia, the former Soviet republics, which are now independent. So there's always a changing map of the world. And I think, we have to dial back a little bit and think big picture. First and foremost, I consider myself very fortunate, an accident of birth, to have been born in America, a very wealthy country, a country where we have a lot of opportunities, where we have a relatively capitalist system. And I don't consider that something that we should take lightly at all. I love this country, and I love the opportunities it provides, and I feel fortunate for it. But do political arrangements exist to serve us, or the other way around? That's a very interesting question. So what you bring up about some of these counties moving around, or wishing to move around, and also the great migration of Americans within our national borders since the COVID crisis, is in and of itself, I think, a form of soft secession that's happening, not in any official manner, but happening nonetheless.
I think for a lot of Americans, though, when they hear the word secession, the national divorce, these are triggering words to them, because all they can think about is 1863. All they can think about is the Civil War and slavery. And so secession is always evil. There's a sort of like a bad connection to there, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I think that's definitely true. I also think it's unfortunate, because to the extent people just have concrete between their ears, and so they'll always associate any sort of breakup of the United States with the Confederacy, with slavery itself. That's always going to be a bad thing. And I think some people would resist the idea for honorable or good faith reasons. I don't discount that at all. However, I think a lot of people who oppose the idea do so for bad faith and dishonorable reasons. And let me tell you what I mean. Progressives are convinced, left progressives, that the route is on. And they are going to control the United States. They are going to be a uniparty. All 50 states are going to fall to their rule eventually. And when you have that doctrine of inevitability in your mind, then why should you let a single inch of turf go? So the fact that progressives think that they are, or soon will be, the absolute rulers of the United States, I think is a big part of the left's reaction to this. And of course, it's mostly people on the right, not entirely, but mostly people on the right advocating for it. So it quickly breaks down over sort of tribal lines. But here's the great irony in all this for the left, and especially for people who are seriously devout Catholics, like my wife. The left could have virtually everything it wants right here, right now, today, if it was simply allow a very healthy degree of federalism within these 50 United States. In other words, California could have its own gun laws, its own abortion laws, its own climate change laws, its own deeply progressive taxation. It could require all of its corporations to have DEI and ESG boards. It could do all those things right here and right now with pretty large majorities, probably 60, 70% majorities of California residents in favor of that. But the price they would have to pay is to say we are not nationalizing these issues anymore. We are not deciding for 330 million people amongst 9 Supreme Court justices anymore. That's not how we're going to do it. And so while we're allowed to do all this, the state of Alabama, where I happen to live, my son is in Cullman. I think the left would call it a deep red state, is also allowed to have its own abortion and gun laws and otherwise. So this is an offer that I think the left would take if they didn't think they were winning. But since they think they're winning, why would they take an offer like that? So I think left progressives say secession is for losers and we're winning.
Well, it's interesting because isn't this what the Dobbs decision essentially did for us? They said, no, these issues have to be pushed back to the states and states to get to decide. And we are actually seeing this division right in front of our very eyes. California, New York want to become, abortion sanctuaries. They want to become abortion vacation destinations. Whereas Texas and other states are like, no, thank you. We don't want this anymore. And so we're seeing that divide. I think we're also seeing that divide when it comes to the transgender ideology. We're seeing states push back and saying, we don't want this insanity in our schools. We don't want this in our communities. And then there's other states, again, California being on that list, that are like, yeah, bring it on. We want all the insanity. So, but then it comes to the question, how do you eventually avoid pushing these ideas to all states? Because it all started with interstate laws that needed to be set up so that they could be managed across states. So it's just going to be a swinging pendulum, will it not? I mean, we may be over here with states' rights again, but aren't we just going to see more federal overreach down the road?
Well, I think there's always that tendency. All governments attempt to centralize and grow. That's the nature of power, not just government or governmental power, but all kinds of power. So yes, I think that has to be resisted. And the idea that that is a fact of life, a stubborn fact of life, shouldn't give us pause or take away our courage. In other words, that's what life is. Sometimes you have to get up in the morning and work or fight to have the kind of world in which you want to live, or more importantly, the kind of world for our children and grandchildren. That's the concern here. You and I can talk about trans and say, hey, we disagree with this craziness and we can resist it. But it's younger people who are at risk from all of this. So I think we have to start there and say that there's a pretty big critical mass of people in America who are relatively like-minded. If only 10% of this country really agreed with, let's say, the viewpoint or perspective of the majority of listeners of this show, that's 33 million people. That's a country, that's a nation larger than half of Europe. So what America is right now is many, many nations. It's not one nation, it's many nations. Now, those nations are a little murky. They're starting to coalesce. They're not always along easy geographic lines, but nonetheless, they exist. We're not much of a country at this point, and I would say on the national level, we're largely an economic arrangement. In other words, our economy works fairly well relative to the rest of the country. Our delivery systems, our transport, our energy, our highways, our travel, all that works. But a political arrangement is not enough. And as America becomes increasingly secular, and the statistics on that are very, very clear, actual church attendance, the actual religious observation, I mean, the secularization of America is continuing apace rapidly. As that continues, you're going to find more and more people who have nothing in their head or their heart to coalesce around other than progressivism in the state. That will be their animating feature in life. I think that's sad, but it's true. So we have to have an alternative to that as an animating impulse to offer younger people.
Jeff Deist is the president of the Mises Institute. His website is mises.org. That's MISES.org. There's an article over there called "It's Time for a National Divorce," published back in January by Mark Metz. And it's a great little article. And it sums up, some very realistic scenarios in which you might find a breakup of the country. But I think it also begs big questions. Jeff, good morning to you again. Thank you for your time. So the biggest on my mind, and I think a lot of listeners right now are thinking, if this does ever happen, and I guess that's the first question, what's the real probability we're talking about here? Number one. And number two, if that ever did happen, isn't it game, set, match for China? I mean, who's to stop them if there's no America? It's bad now. It'll be worse then. What say you, Jeff?
Well, I think it happens by virtue of the United States losing the ability to pay its bills, to meaningfully provide what it claims to provide at the federal level. In other words, the national debt and entitlements and dollar scenarios are becoming increasingly dire. I don't think it happens through some constitutional convention or some agreement between states or something where we all get together. I don't think national governments tend to not give up power. So I think it would be more a case of Atlas shrugging. And you can look at the former Soviet Union, for example. If you had been in Moscow or if you had been in Washington, D.C. think tank in 1983, and you would have told people by the end of this decade, the USSR will break up and Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, for example, will be free republics, you would have been absolutely laughed out of the room, and people would have said, "How is that possible?" So I don't think this happens again by agreement, because some of the structural issues you mentioned before the break, the debt, national defense, for example, federal land, the U.S. military, all of these things are kind of hard to divvy up through any political agreement. I think it happens because the federal government loses control ultimately of what it purports to do. And so people sort of turn back towards their states, their state governments, their state boundaries as something that can actually technically work in terms of fixing potholes or whatever it might be. I think the U.S. government is so far flung and so stretched thin across the globe that I think at some point we're simply going to be unable to pay our bills in a meaningful way. And let's not forget, those bills include hundreds of trillions of dollars in promised entitlements, Social Security and Medicare in particular, over the coming decades as the over 65 population doubles. So the China question is interesting. I think I would argue that China is far more of a paper tiger economically than people think. Now, clearly, it's a military power, as is Russia, and nuclear armed. And so we always have to use diplomacy and use our brains when dealing with aggressors. But I think economically, China is far worse off than the United States. I think economically, China's demographic issues, for example, its central bank issues, basically mean that it is going to struggle like the former Soviet Union struggled, even to maintain its military might. Now, remember, after the fall of the wall, we found out that the vaunted Soviet military might was not so vaunted. In other words, a lot of their equipment didn't work. A huge percentage of those missiles were rotting in silos and inoperable. And frankly, this was all because the people themselves were quite literally starving. And I think that is soon, if not already, the case in China. And so I am probably less hawkish than you with respect to them. But nonetheless, I don't think that there's any reason that Western defensive alliances could not be maintained. In fact, I don't even think there's any reason why the national government and its military couldn't be maintained in some sort of defensive alliance among states or among regions within the current United States, because I think it would be practical and in everyone's self-interest to maintain that. But I got to tell you, these geopolitical things, these are thorny questions. They're above my pay grade, and they may, in fact, be the reason why this national divorce that we're speaking of today ultimately doesn't happen.
It's interesting you mentioned about the national debt could possibly be the trigger that sets things off, because yesterday I read a report that said the chances of a default this year up 300% since January. I mean, I think it's like at 11 something percent, 11.5% chance that we're going to default sometime this year. And we've already hit the ceiling, the debt default ceiling, and they're talking about raising it yet again in Congress.
They will definitely raise it. They will raise it until they can't. And that day is when people simply won't buy U.S. Treasury bonds. But the biggest buyer of U.S. Treasury bonds soon will be our own central bank. So that's a bit of a circular arrangement. But interest on the debt within a few years is going to be over $1 trillion a year. So in other words, just to make what is the equivalent of a minimum payment on a credit card, minimum payment, not paying down the balance, but a minimum payment of interest on a credit card will soon be the biggest line item in Congress's budget every year. In the next few years, and this isn't just my wild prediction, this is the Congressional Budget Office saying this. So people want national defense, people worry about China, but we'll be spending somewhere, let's say 1.3 trillion a year servicing our debt, whereas the DoD budget will be 800 or 900 billion. So the defense budget will be smaller than interest. So the idea that we need to spend unlimited amounts of money, including borrowed money, to police the world to make us safer is at the same time making us less safe because it's eroding the fiscal viability of the United States. So that's, I worry far more about that than I do Chinese aggression.
There's another argument that I've listened to some of the podcasts that come out of the Mises Institute. Very great stuff, by the way. You can check out their YouTube channel. I would recommend you do so. I'll put a link to that in my show notes as well. And, just the general argument of if the far left hates the far right, why would the far right want to be married to them at all?
Well, it's an abusive relationship, no doubt about it. And I'm not sure that we're more divided than ever, or whether social media just makes it possible for us to know what's in other people's heads and hearts in a way that we didn't know before. So I think social media is in many ways a disaster for America. It can't really be stopped, I wouldn't imagine, nor would I suggest attempting. But nonetheless, I think it's very harmful, and it encourages, obviously, a lot of hatred and division. But nonetheless, we have to be clear-eyed and about the situation. And so in that sense, the silver lining is that now we know, and maybe more people on the right are waking up to the idea that we need to be thinking along those lines, that this isn't viable in the long term. It's not healthy in the long term.
All right. So you have about a minute left. So very short amount of time. Give us your perfect scenario of a national divorce. What would it look like from your worldview?
My perfect scenario would be an organic evolution. I think it would look like very strong federalism, where the national government was tasked with just a few very small obligations like national defense, and that states would really become quite robust in their own governance. It would look a lot like Switzerland. If you go to the Swiss government's webpage, they talk about the Catholic principle of subsidiarity and very aggressive federalism, where most of our taxes would go to the local government and very few to the national.